that she was unable to extricate herself from the relationship. There was even testimony that she had called the police before, and the police had come over and kind of rolled their eyes and dismissed this as just a domestic incident. And at one point, I believe one of the police officers joked, "Why don't you just arrest him yourself?" So at the end of the day, Stonehouse was imprisoned for many, many years before her case was finally reversed by a judge who said that it was astonishing, the amount of evidence that she had of past abuse, and yet her jury's denial that she had done everything she possibly could to try to get legal protection against this man. So what I like to say when I'm talking about issues of intimate partner violence and self-defensive violence is that many women in violent relationships are double or triply victimized. First, they're victimized by their intimate partner who sometimes physically violate them, sometimes they threaten their lives. And the women experience this and find no way of getting out of it because our legal system doesn't adequately protect domestic violence survivors. And then secondly, when these women try to protect themselves by standing their ground, even in states that have strong stand your ground laws, when these women actively arm themselves and try to protect themselves from their violent partners, they end up incarcerated more often than not. So I find it fascinating that our dominant society likes to celebrate this notion that everybody has a natural right to defend themselves, when in reality, when you look at Carol Stonehouse and other survivors of intimate partner violence, when they try to protect themselves from their violent male partners, they end up going to prison.
Now, I thought this stood in interesting contrast to the case of Bernard Goetz in New York. What was that story, and how is that, different in terms of how the outcome played out?
Yeah, this was fascinating. These cases just happened within, I believe, just a year or so of each other. Bernard Goetz was in New York City, and this is a more famous case. I believe it was in the early 80s that Bernard Goetz was on the subway when he was approached by 4 black teenage young men, one of whom said, "Give me $5. And Goetz had, I believe, an unlicensed gun with him. He took out his gun and shot the young men right there on the subway and then ran away. He fled the scene, knowing that he had probably done wrong. At no point did the teenagers threaten him with a weapon. Witnesses, they were unarmed. No witnesses said that they had physically threatened Goetz. So what ended up happening was eventually Goetz turned himself in to law enforcement, confessed to shooting the young men, and then when he went to trial, he was acquitted. I believe the only infraction that he was convicted of was possession of an illegal firearm, because I believe he wasn't licensed. So this happens in the 1980s, New York City. Many people hailed Goetz as a hero for standing up for himself against so-called thugs and criminals. The racial politics of this were fascinating because there were many people who felt like crime was rampant, and if everyday citizens didn't stand up for themselves, so-called thugs and criminals would take over the whole city. So there was a lot of interesting celebratory rhetoric around Bernard Goetz, whereas with Carol Stonehouse's case, you see a case of a person who had been subject to violence for several years, standing up to her attacker, and ending up in prison. I can't remember how much time he served, but it wasn't very long. And again, he was by many people hailed as a hero for standing his ground against so-called criminal thugs.
Now, there's also this concept of imminent threat. How does that enter into each of those cases?
Yes, technically, in the court of law, it's not just that you have to feel like you're under threat. It has to be an imminent threat, meaning that in that very moment, you're in fear for your life. Somebody could kill you in that very moment. That's what imminence is. It's not just that, oh, there's somebody there who may eventually in the next couple of hours harm you. So imminence, however, is in the eye of the beholder. We could think about Trayvon Martin's case in 2012. As you probably know, George Zimmerman, who was a neighborhood watchman who was armed, reported that he saw Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black man with holding iced tea and Skittles, I believe, wearing a hoodie in a Florida community, predominantly white Florida community. And Zimmerman saw Martin, called 911, and the folks at 911, the dispatch, said, please don't pursue him. We will send police. Zimmerman, however, chose to pursue Trayvon Martin. And then eventually they have a confrontation during which Zimmerman shoots and kills Trayvon. So he claims that he shot and killed Martin because he felt like he was in imminent danger of losing his life. And of course, as I've mentioned before, when the only witness is the one who killed the decedent, that's all you have is his word. And so in the courtroom, his jury was prepared to believe George Zimmerman's allegation that 17-year-old unarmed Trayvon Martin posed an imminent threat to Zimmerman in that moment. So imminence has a lot to do with, again, perceptions of reasonable threat. Had Trayvon Martin been a white person, had he been a woman, the jury's perceptions might have been different. I'm not sure. There's the case also of Renisha McBride, which I believe was the same year in Detroit in 2012, where Renisha McBride, African-American, 19-year-old woman, in the middle of the night, wrecked her car and went and knocked on the door of a white man in Detroit again, and it's middle of the night. And he, without even really looking, without even really fully opening the door, could see Renisha McBride, could see a brown face on the other side of the door and shot and killed her. And so he did end up getting convicted. And in that case, I think it has everything to do with the fact that she was a young woman standing there. I wonder what the jury would have thought had she not. So imminence has everything to do, I think, with the race and the gender of the person who is shot and killed, and also with the person who pulls the trigger.
So I can't remember if I included this in my email. It might have come to me afterwards. But there's the story also of Operation Hero Guard involving this idea that military personnel were sitting ducks and needed to be defended. Yeah. I thought that was really interesting. Here, you needed to protect military personnel who were seen as vulnerable, and yet a police woman officer was supposed to defend herself.
Yeah, exactly. It's the Operation Hero Guard is fascinating. I don't know if the organization continues necessarily, but it was in response to a shooting at a military recruitment center, because technically at those centers you're not supposed to have any firearms. And so in the wake,